Today, the Hamburg radio announced the death of Adolf Hitler. This report from the enemy has had no official confirmation from allied sources.
We've all been told the same story. Adolf Hitler died in his bunker in 1945, case closed. But what if that's not the full truth? Joe Rogan has questioned the official narrative, discussing declassified files, missing evidence, and bizarre eyewitness reports.
The official story is that he himself, right?
Yep.
And is there any photographic evidence of his death or anything?
Yeah. The Russians got the body, and when they brought it back to Moscow, nobody has ever been able to independently verify who and what this body is.
Could history have gotten it wrong? And why do so many people, including intelligence agencies, still doubt the official story? The answers might shock you. The missing body. Where's the proof? For such a significant historical event, the actual evidence of Hitler's death is surprisingly thin. We're told his body was burned after he died, but what was left behind? A pile of ashes, some bones, and a skull fragment supposedly recovered by Soviet forces. That might sound like a closed case until you realize that every major piece of physical evidence has been questioned, dismissed, or outright debunked. The most damning blow to the official story came in 2009 when a DNA test was performed on the infamous skull fragment held by the Russian government. This was the piece of evidence that had been presented as definitive proof of Hitler's. Except there was one major problem: it wasn't his. The DNA revealed that the skull belonged to a woman, likely in her 40s. The entire foundation of the forensic case for Hitler's death crumbled in an instant. But that's not the only missing piece. The Soviet Union, which first reached Hitler's bunker, kept the alleged remains under tight secrecy. Stalin himself publicly stated he believed Hitler had escaped, and for years the USSR gave conflicting accounts of what had actually been recovered. First, they claimed to have found the body, then they said it was burned beyond recognition. Later, they admitted they never had all of Hitler's remains, just fragments. So, which version was true? And let's talk about those fragments. The only widely accepted physical remains of Hitler are a piece of jawbone and a few teeth, reportedly confirmed by dental records. But here's where things get murky. Those records were not found in the bunker. They were given to investigators later by Hitler's dentist's assistant, who, under Soviet custody, had every reason to say whatever they wanted her to say. If we were dealing with any other historical figure, this level of uncertainty would be unacceptable. Imagine a modern high-profile criminal or dictator supposedly dying, and the only evidence provided was a few questionable teeth and a skull that turned out to belong to someone else. Would anyone accept that as absolute proof? Probably not. Adding to the confusion, declassified FBI documents reveal that American intelligence agencies were skeptical about Hitler's death for years after the war. Reports kept surfacing from South America, particularly Argentina, where alleged witnesses claimed to have seen Hitler alive. These were dismissed as conspiracy theories at the time, but in hindsight, why was the US government even entertaining the possibility of his escape if they were so sure he was dead? The fact remains, we have no full body, no definitive forensic proof beyond a few controversial teeth, and a mountain of conflicting reports from the very people who claim to have confirmed Hitler's death. That doesn't mean he did escape, but it raises a serious question. If the world's most infamous dictator truly died in that bunker, why does the evidence feel so inconclusive? But if the official story has so many holes, why do so many people still believe it without question? Joe Rogan has built his podcast on asking the uncomfortable questions mainstream media often ignores. And when it comes to Hitler's death, he's had some mind-bending discussions that force you to rethink everything you thought you knew. From declassified documents to expert guests, Rogan has entertained the idea that Hitler's fate might not be as simple as history books claim. One of the most notable episodes on this topic featured former Green Beret and Special Forces operator Tim Kennedy, who was part of the History Channel's Hunting Hitler series. In that discussion, Kennedy laid out why the official story doesn't add up and why the possibility of an escape shouldn't be dismissed outright. He pointed out how actual FBI reports considered the idea that Hitler could have fled to South America, and how the known Nazi escape routes out of Europe give this theory far more weight than most people realize. Rogan, always skeptical but open-minded, was fascinated by the idea that world governments may have buried certain truths about Hitler's disappearance. During the episode, he questioned how dictators and war criminals throughout history have faked deaths, disappeared, or been protected by foreign governments. "It's not crazy to think this guy could have gotten out," Rogan said. "People act like history is always told 100% accurately, but we know that's not true." And he's right. Governments have hidden history before, from Operation Paperclip, where the U.S. secretly brought Nazi scientists to America after the war, to the Vatican's involvement in smuggling Nazi fugitives. History is full of cover-ups and secret deals. So why would we blindly assume the truth about Hitler was told to the public without any manipulation? Another guest, journalist and author Gerard Williams, who co-wrote Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler, explained how real declassified intelligence files suggest Hitler was possibly alive well into the 1950s. Williams argued that if the world's most powerful intelligence agencies weren't fully convinced Hitler died in the bunker, why should the general public accept the story without question? Rogan also discussed how powerful figures escaping justice isn't unheard of. He compared it to other war criminals who vanished for decades, like Joseph Mengele, the Nazi doctor known as the Angel of Death, who lived in South America undisturbed for years. If someone as high profile as Mengele could disappear, why wouldn't Hitler, who had far more resources, be able to pull it off? And that's where things get unsettling. The more Rogan explored the topic, the clearer it became that the world just wanted to believe Hitler was gone. After all, if he had truly escaped, what would that mean for history? What would that mean for the people who closed the case? Rogan doesn't claim to know the answer, but his deep dives into the subject make one thing clear. If you think history is always as simple as it's written in textbooks, you might want to think again. But if escaping was even remotely possible, how would Hitler have pulled it off? That's exactly what the Hunting Hitler investigation set out to uncover. This History Channel series, featuring ex-Green Beret Tim Kennedy, former CIA operatives, and war crime investigators, wasn't just another conspiracy theory show. It took a military and intelligence-based approach, treating the question of Hitler's escape like a cold case, following real leads, analyzing documents, and physically searching locations where he might have fled. And the results? More shocking than most expected. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from declassified FBI files, which included reports of people claiming to have seen Hitler in Argentina years after the war. The show's team tracked these claims, looking into how Nazis actually did escape through underground networks known as the Rat Lines, using smuggled passports and connections in Spain, Italy, and Argentina. Kennedy and his team uncovered Nazi safe houses in Argentina, deep in the remote regions of the country, places specifically designed to hide someone important. Some of these locations had German architecture, access to secret escape routes, and even tunnels underneath them, perfect for someone avoiding capture. Could one of these compounds have been built for Hitler? Perhaps the biggest revelation came from air traffic records and missing U-boats. Hunting Hitler followed reports that multiple German submarines disappeared from their known positions at the end of World War II. Strikingly, 2 of them later surfaced off the coast of Argentina, one of them surrendering months after the war ended. If submarines were still in operation long after Germany had officially fallen, what or who were they transporting? Joe Rogan was fascinated by these findings, especially when Tim Kennedy appeared on his podcast to break them down. During their conversation, Kennedy laid out how the logistics of Hitler escaping weren't as far-fetched as many think.
Anyone with power. The Nuremberg trials were not a witch hunt, but it was to close a chapter so we could start moving forward with communism. That's what it was.
He explained how Nazi officers, including high-ranking figures like Josef Mengele and Adolf Eichmann, actually did flee to Argentina using these same methods. If they could do it, why not Hitler? One of the more bizarre but chilling elements of Hunting Hitler was an Argentinian eyewitness account from an old man who claimed his father worked for a German landowner in the 1950s, one who looked eerily like Hitler, complete with the same haircut and mustache, but with a changed name. While anecdotal, this matched dozens of other reports that surfaced in the years after the war. However, the show wasn't without criticism. Some historians dismissed it, saying it relied too much on circumstantial evidence and lacked absolute proof. But Kennedy's counter-argument was simple. If we investigate modern war criminals with this much evidence, we wouldn't just dismiss it, we'd dig deeper. But here's the real question: why were so many Nazis found in Argentina in the first place? If Hitler escaping sounds impossible, consider this: dozens of high-ranking Nazis actually did it, and they weren't just low-level officers hiding out. Some of Hitler's closest allies made their way to Argentina, Brazil, and Chile after the war, living out their lives in secret until they were eventually caught. If these men could flee, why wouldn't the most powerful Nazi of them all have done the same? One of the most infamous cases was Adolf Eichmann, the mastermind behind the Holocaust's logistics. He didn't just vanish, he lived in Buenos Aires under a false identity for 15 years, even raising a family, before Israeli agents captured him in 1960. The man who orchestrated the transportation of millions to concentration camps managed to slip through the cracks and start a new life. Then there was Joseph Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, who escaped first to Argentina, then Paraguay, and finally Brazil. He was never caught and died peacefully in 1979, having spent decades living under false names while being protected by a network of ex-Nazis and sympathizers. How did they get there? Through the rat lines, underground escape routes set up with the help of Nazi supporters, corrupt officials, and even some members of the Catholic Church. The Vatican's involvement in smuggling war criminals out of Europe is well documented, with some priests helping Nazis obtain fake passports and visas to South America. Argentina in particular was a safe haven. Its president at the time, Juan Perón, was openly sympathetic to Nazi ideology and allowed thousands of former SS officers, scientists, and military officials to settle there. Entire German colonies formed in the remote regions of Argentina and Chile, where Nazi fugitives could blend in without fear of being recognized. Some of these villages still exist today, with architecture and traditions that look straight out of 1940s Germany. Joe Rogan, in discussing these facts on his podcast, pointed out something chilling. If Hitler wanted to escape, the infrastructure was already there. He wouldn't have needed to create an escape plan from scratch because others had done it before him. The rat lines were in full operation, Argentina was accepting high-ranking Nazis, and powerful people were willing to protect them. So, was Hitler just another Nazi who slipped through the cracks, or was his case different? The sheer number of confirmed Nazi fugitives in South America makes the idea of his escape plausible, if not proven. And if history has shown us anything, it's that the truth is often buried under layers of deception, missing evidence, and the simple fact that people believe what they want to believe. But if Hitler really escaped, wouldn't someone have seen him? That's where things get even stranger. Over the decades, countless people have claimed to have spotted Hitler, not in Germany, but in South America. These aren't just wild stories from unreliable sources. Some reports came from former intelligence officers, government documents, and even locals who described encounters with a man who looked exactly like Hitler, living under different names. One of the earliest and most bizarre sightings came from Argentina in 1945, just months after the war ended. An informant told the FBI that Hitler had been smuggled into the country and was living in the foothills of the Andes, protected by loyal supporters. The tip was detailed enough that the U.S. government opened an official case file on it, which remained classified for decades. If the idea of Hitler's escape was so absurd, why was the FBI even investigating it? Then came the reports from Brazil and Chile. Some villagers in remote areas described a mysterious German man living among them in the 1950s and 1960s. He had an intense presence, never spoke much about his past, and was always surrounded by former Nazis who had already been identified as fugitives. The description: short with a distinctive mustache and piercing eyes. One of the most well-known sightings came from a former CIA agent stationed in Colombia in 1954. He reported that an informant had personally met a man believed to be Hitler, now bald but still unmistakably him. This claim was sent up the chain of command and eventually became part of declassified CIA documents that surfaced decades later.
So what's the official story? The official story is that he killed himself, right?
Yep.
He killed himself in the bunker with
Yeah.
Eva Braun.
Yep.
And is there any photographic evidence of his death or anything?
Joe Rogan has discussed these sightings on his podcast, pointing out how history has a pattern of underestimating dictators' ability to disappear. He compared it to cases like Saddam Hussein, who managed to hide in a simple hole in the ground despite being one of the most wanted men in the world. People think it's impossible, Rogan said, but powerful people have a way of slipping through the cracks when history wants to believe they're gone. And then there's the photo evidence. In the 2010s, a blurry photograph surfaced, allegedly showing an elderly Hitler living in Argentina in the 1970s. While inconclusive, it reignited the debate, especially when compared with aged facial reconstructions of what Hitler would have looked like at that time. Some forensic analysts even argued that the resemblance was uncanny.
Just because the photograph is found in Argentina doesn't mean that's where the photograph was taken. We don't know what it is.
Of course, skeptics say these sightings are just misidentifications, fabrications, or exaggerated myths. But here's the thing. When similar reports surfaced about Adolf Eichmann, they were dismissed too. Until, of course, he was actually found living in Buenos Aires under a false name. But why do so many people want to believe Hitler escaped? At first glance, the idea of Hitler surviving beyond 1945 seems like it would be a terrifying thought. So why does it persist? Why do people keep searching for clues, writing books, making documentaries, and discussing it on platforms like Joe Rogan's podcast? The answer isn't just about history, it's about psychology, fear, and the human need for a compelling story. One of the biggest reasons is how unsatisfying the official story feels. People expect the world's most notorious dictator to have faced justice, capture, or at least public proof of his end. Instead, we got a vague story of a bunker a body burned beyond recognition, and unreliable evidence that was controlled by the Soviets, one of the least trustworthy sources at the time. That alone made people wonder, was that really it? Then there's the way history has handled powerful villains in the past. Think about Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, or even Mussolini. All of them were eventually captured, or their deaths were publicly confirmed. But Hitler? His death was behind closed doors, and the only people who could verify it were his most loyal supporters, the same people who had every reason to lie if he had actually escaped. That uncertainty fuels doubt, and doubt is the perfect breeding ground for conspiracy theories. Another reason this theory won't die is that people love a mystery. Throughout history, myths about famous figures faking their deaths have always existed. From Elvis Presley to Tupac Shakur, the idea that someone so significant could have cheated death is more exciting than simply accepting their demise. And with Hitler, the stakes are even higher, because if he did escape, it would mean we've been told an incomplete or manipulated version of history. Joe Rogan has touched on this idea, discussing how governments lie all the time, and that history is often written by those in power. He's questioned why people are so quick to accept official narratives when we've seen cover-ups exposed time and time again. Look at all the things they told us were true that turned out to be total BS, he said on one episode. So why would this be any different? Finally, the idea of Hitler escaping taps into a deep psychological fear, the fear that true evil isn't always defeated. If Hitler died in that bunker, then the story ends. Good triumphed over evil. But if he escaped, that means the story never truly had closure, and that evil could have lived on in some hidden part of the world. It makes the idea of history being settled feel uncomfortable, and some people would rather keep searching for answers than accept an unsatisfying conclusion. Despite all the speculation, basically all historians agree he didn't. The overwhelming evidence, from eyewitness accounts of his final days to the dental records that match his remains, strongly supports the conclusion that Hitler died in the bunker on April 30th, 1945. The theories, while fascinating, rely on weak or circumstantial evidence, and no credible proof has ever surfaced to suggest he made it out alive. Still, it's no surprise that these conspiracies exist. When a figure as infamous as Hitler dies in secrecy, without a public body, people will question it, just like they always have with other historical figures.